Welcome back. Greg Sadler will now introduce Jackson Colter. Thank you.
So I've got a little bit of a different introduction than we usually do with this. So I'm going to tell you first about Jackson and the relevant matters. He has his BA from University of Wyoming and recently defended his master's thesis, How to Prioritize as a Citizen of the Universe from Colorado State University. So you may have guessed by the name that he is related to our panelist, Rob Colter. He is, in fact, his son. And Jackson is the outreach coordinator at the Wyoming Pathways from Prison. And you might say, well, why wasn't he on the panel? Well, we didn't want to load it up with too many Colters. And we're giving Jackson his own slot here. And the reason we're doing that is because I was a guest at Stoic Camp this year, and Jackson was one of the guest speakers coming in. And his talk was specifically about cosmopolitanism. And since we already had that established as a theme, I'm always on the lookout wherever I go. You could say almost like a scout looking for new talent to bring in. And this was just an ideal opportunity to say, after he gave his talk, hey, we're talking about this at Stoicon. What do you think about the idea of coming on and, you know, not that, Stoic Camp, which is a much more intimate and intense experience in many ways because we're there for days on end, is lesser of a stage. But how would you like to come on to the big stage at Stoicon? And of course, Jackson said, yes, that would be a great idea, not motivated by any personal ambition, but solely to do his duty. He'll tell you whether that's the case or not. And so, with no further ado, I'm going to turn the stage over to Jackson. I will come back on when we're ready for the Q&A and feed him some questions. But go ahead, Jackson, you take over, and I'm going to shuffle off.
So thanks, Greg, for the wonderful introduction, and thanks to the whole Modern Stoicism team for letting me come up on the big stage today, so to speak. I'm going to go ahead and share a few slides with you guys, not so much for content, but more for reference, just because I'm a younger academic and I can't help myself but provide citations when I talk about this stuff. And so I want to talk a little bit today about part of the reason that I think cosmopolitanism is such a special topic academically. And for me, that motivation is largely personal. Partially due to my last name and the circumstances in which I was born, I managed to get exposed to Stoicism at a relatively young age. I was able to encounter it and sort of really engage with it at only 20 years old. And that was really important for me because that was a point in my life where I had been studying philosophy in school, but I had yet to sort of connect it to actually living my life. And I very well understood the sort of importance of being a good person. But I really felt that a lot of the philosophies I studied were not giving me a procedure for how that was actually done. And I think that cosmopolitanism does sort of a job of providing that procedure, albeit in perhaps vague terms. And I think that it does a better job of doing it than a lot of the other philosophies. Another thing I think is really fascinating about cosmopolitanism as a philosophical concept is that many of our sources on it really come from these later Stoics, right? We're dealing with most of our complete descriptions come from Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and Epictetus, but there are clearly sort of threads in it in the earlier Stoic works, right? We get these sort of distinct pieces of what I think you need for cosmopolitanism from works as early as Zeno and Chrysippus, right? The first and third heads of the Stoic school, respectively. And I think that what I hope to show today is you can take these sort of core pieces from the early Stoics, and I think you really only need those to build out cosmopolitanism. And I think we can get this from the idea that Stoics were logicians. They were really sort of focused on logic. And I think that what results from that is this sort of almost derivability of an other-oriented code of ethics from an inward-lurking virtue system. And I think that's really philosophically special. I'd always been rather interested in virtue systems, and I think the other two that come to mind as far as big systems are sort of Aristotelian virtue ethics and Confucian virtue ethics. And I think that And though I'm no talented scholar of those two schools, I think Stoicism does a much better job of providing us a picture from how we go from our internal lives to the outward, right? Essentially, how we go from ourselves to the cosmos. So I want to kind of take you on that sort of theoretical journey today. I could just sit here and put up citations from Marcus and Seneca and Epictetus, and I will be doing some of that, but I'm not trying to prove to you that the Stoics believed in cosmopolitanism, right? What I want to show is that you can really take these sort of early core pieces of Stoic theory and get cosmopolitanism out of it. So, like pretty much all things, our starting point is going to be virtue, right? Any work we do in Stoicism, we're going to be coming back to this core virtue, this core idea of virtue, that is. And so we're all familiar with this basic description, right? We all know that virtue is to live according to nature. But what I want to point out specifically in this passage is that virtue is the chief good, right? Bit of context about these passages. They come to us from Diogenes Laertius. He wrote an anthology of ancient Greek philosophy and early Roman philosophy called The Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers. And he really just wanted to sort of compile and keep track of all the different views of Greek philosophy throughout the years and preserve that for future generations. And so we get this sort of anthological work, but he credits sort of ideas to individuals within the school. And here, when in the Life of Zeno section of his book, he describes what it takes to be the sort of core common Stoic principles, right? These are the core things. Virtue being the chief good is something that's going to be pretty important for us as we move down the line here. But we all are familiar with this basic framework, right? Living according to nature. But that, I don't think any of us read that and immediately were certain of how to live according to Stoic virtue, right? When I first read Live in Accord with Nature, my first temptation is to do something like go camping, right? Really, get out under the stars and watch sunset. Of course, we can refine these notions of nature and all that. But so we turn later to Chrysippus, right? Credited again in Diogenes Laertius, who gives us a bit more clear explanation, right? To live according to virtue is the same thing as living according to our experience of those things which happen by nature. And I think this touches on a point that Dr. Rudolph brought up earlier, right, in her discussion of Martha Nussbaum's critiques, which is that Stoics aren't supposed to transcend their humanity in any way, right? We're not supposed to be something else than what we are. And the way that we get all of our information is through our experiences, right? Stoics are going to say that is essential, right? That's going to be how we kind of move forward. Our experiences are going to be the path forward, right? So now I'm going to do a bit of the philosopher move, again, as referenced by Dr. Rudolph, and ask, what do we mean by nature, right? What do we mean by these concepts that we're referring to? And for Stoics, these are very particular concepts, right? It's not only the case that we have nature as in the birds, the bees, and the trees, but they use nature in this term that is really loaded, really sort of specific. And so what Chrysippus, again, he's credited with this quote, tells us is that nature, as he calls it, is really composed of two parts, the individual natures and the universal nature. We can think of, in my mind, I think of it as the universal nature being the full set of all things in the universe, and that individual nature being its constituents, right? We're not going to be able to live in accord with the full set without also living in accord with those pieces of the set, those parts. And so what Chrysippus tells us, right, is that this one's own nature and this universal nature are both going to need to inform how we actually live in accord with nature. One can think of this as kind of taking a macro view of nature and a micro view of nature, right? We need to do two things. We not only need to sort of live in accord with the nature of everything, but also with the nature of us. We cannot forget at any point, right, what we are and what we do. Now, a little bit on this universal nature here. I want to sort of talk about this because it is a weird entity that the Stoics invoke here. And you'll see lower in this Diogenes Laertius citation that they actually translate this as Jupiter. Chrysippus says, right? It's a common law, identical with that right reason which pervades everything, being the same with Jupiter. And Stoics in general, when they talk about God or nature or Zeus, they're really always referring to the same entity, right? There's a sort of divinity and absoluteness with which they speak about nature. It is for them the source of all things, and it's the most powerful of all things, so to speak. But I'm not sure that divinity element is entirely necessary for what we're talking about here, right? What we need to know is that for the Stoics, the universe itself, the universal nature, is actually a distinctively rational being. And even the sort of structure to which the individual constituents of nature have organized, one can think of as being rational in a sense, right? And it's that sort of distinctive rationality that we need to live in accord with. Now, naturally, that sort of raises questions about what we mean by our nature. If that's the universal nature, how do we actually deal with our individual natures as well? Naturally, the Stoics have a particular conception about what they take human nature to be, right? And the most fundamental piece of that is that we are rational beings, of course, right? Epictetus tells us that the gods have placed in our power only the best faculty of all. And in other places in the discourses, he tells us that that faculty is rationality, right? Makes an argument that rationality can examine all other things as its object. It can examine all other things as subjects of rationality. It has sort of the ability to regulate these other things. And so this most fundamental capacity, Epictetus and other Stoics thinks, is really that which is most essential to our nature, right? Importantly here, what he says at the end, everything else they haven't placed within our power. And I think that gives us a sort of tension, right? We have this sort of external world, but it's not in our power. And as I think this leads to the sort of criticisms that Nussbaum offers, right? Where we have this person who is, completely dissociating themselves from the world, right? And I think that sort of ignores a different point about human nature that is important. That really Stoics take it that we are naturally social beings as well. And, we have this description here, again, picking on Marcus Aurelius 2:1. We'll see if I'm the last one today to do so. And, he says, to obstruct each other is natural. To feel anger at someone, to turn your back on them, these are obstructions. It seems like what Marcus is getting at here is a type of social nature, that humans are, in some sense, these sort of fundamentally social animals. And we can sort of see that in Stoic source texts, but I think there's an interesting argument for how that kind of falls out of the fact that we are rational beings. And so rationality is an interesting concept. We see it described in a number of ways, but I think how I think about it in Stoic terms is that rational beings are capable of what I call metaphysical recognition. We're able to tell true from false, reality from illusion, distinguish what is from what is not on a very basic level. And given that we can sort of recognize things for what we really are, we're able to navigate the world using that capacity, right? If I, on a very simple level, see through a foggy window someone that I think is my friend and I wave at them, and it turns out to not be my friend, that allows me to sort of, in the future, tell truth from falsehood in one important way. But I think that an important thing to keep in mind here is how we might do this when we interact with other rational beings, when we interact with each other. And what we would do, ideally, is if we're employing our rationality correctly, is recognize this other rational being as being like us. And that has a number of implications, right? One, they sort of carry a spark of rationality, that same rationality that's inherent of the universe. If we're to take that phrasing, they have a spark of the divine in them, right? That's a really important thing. Also, though, if we're capable of recognizing someone as rational, this in turn means that we know a bit more about what is good for that person or that rational being. It's the same as us. What we must do is live in accord with nature, right? And that is to say, live in accord with the universal nature and to live in accord with our individual nature, right? Based on that alone, I recognize one thing, that this person's virtue looks exactly like mine. And if the moral value of my virtue comes out of my rationality, then that other person is going to have not only some moral value, but the exact same moral value. It's grounded in the exact same way, and I think it provides that same force. again, to reference Dr. Rudolph's wonderful presentation, she used the term ends and means. If we recognize these sort of things, other rational agents, as intrinsically valuable, we really do understand that they are an end. They are the thing that is good, and that good is done for, right? They are capable of virtue, and virtue is the chief good. We know exactly what is the most good for that person. And I think it's that realization that really leads to this social nature that Marcus is talking about, right? If I know what is objectively good for someone, or if I know what is the chief good for someone or something, and I'm choosing not to pursue that good, there's simply no way that I can be virtuous, right? That has to be some sort of moral error for the Stoics. So human nature is rational and social, and that is how we actually need to live in accord with it. So one implication of the social nature that is really important for the Stoics is our natural tendency to form communities, right? They say that friendship exists among the virtuous, that the virtuous would indeed continue to make friends, form communities. And we've talked a little bit about that already today. But also, these communities that we're often born into them, right? When I was born in Boulder, Colorado, I was born into a certain county, a certain state, a certain town, and those all had sort of implications for the way I live my life. And these communities they predated me, right? They existed before me, and they will continue to exist after me, right? It's not as if I pass away that the communities I'm involved in were to suddenly dissipate or disappear. And for that reason, I think we know that that tendency is something we ought to live in accord with, right? These communities, in a sense, are these real sorts of constituents of nature. They're sort of these real divides that exist, right? They are indifference, but they are things that need to be lived in accord with. And so what we can do is we can kind of draw a map around ourselves. This is getting at this familiar image here of the concentric circles, right? If we are at the center, we can designate our family as the first piece, friends as the second, or greater relatives as the second, friends as the third, and so on. And I think that each person's concentric circles are going to look different, right? It's ultimately, in my mind, a graph of the universe that has a different beginning point every time. So of course these are going to look different. And I also really, really like this image because it does emphasize that those lines are there. Maybe we draw them, but those lines are there. And they're real. And living in accord with them is something that we have to do. So again, I'm turning to the Stoic Hierocles there. This is going to be another sort of comes from an anthology type of quote. This one we owe to Stobias, and he credits the Stoic Hierocles with telling us that the task of the wise man, or the well-tempered man, as Hierocles phrases it, is to draw the circle together somehow towards the center. And this is what the sage is doing, right? And I think we can explain this in a very particular way. If we look at all of my distinctions in my circles, right? The distinction of being friends versus family. It's there. It's, I don't share genetic material with people who are not my family, for example, but it's not really something that is based around an essential property of what that person is, right? It's not fundamental to you that you are my friend as opposed to my family, especially not for the Stoics, right? What you are fundamentally is rational, and none of that has to do with whether or not we're born to the same parents, for example. So it seems that a lot of these distinctions, be it distance in our individual family, or friends, or different community lines we might draw, are sort of based on these accidental properties, right? These distinctions that we're making, these lines are drawing, while they might be there in some real sense, they're not fundamental, right? They're not actually sort of really portraying to us what these people are. And I think that's one of the reasons that the sage would pull everyone towards the center, right? But importantly, I take a really strong interpretation of the circles, right? Hierocles is often saying that you should treat everyone as if they were sort of your immediate family, right? I want to take it a little stronger and say that you should treat everyone to the best of your ability as if they were yourself. And, maybe for some of us who are critical of ourselves, that's not necessarily a good thing. But what we want to do is if I'm going to recognize my virtue as valuable and worth pursuing, then I ought to do the same for someone else. And I can't take that all the way, right? I can't immediately treat someone else's mind as if it were my own. That would not be living in accord with the nature of that person's mind. Their mind, importantly, is not up to me. And since it's not up to me, it's something that I have to sort of pull back on, right? It denotes a different response than those minds that might be up to me, than my own mind, right? And so that is a really sort of radical, intense treatment of people, right? It's a radical acceptance of sort. And this is behavior that we would see of the Stoics, or of the Stoic sage, rather. And I think we need to make room for what Greg referred to as the prokopton, or I like to call the progressors, right? We're in development Stoics. So how do we, as in development Stoics, approach this behavior of the stage treating the entire university, or the entire universe, that is, as our family, as ourselves, as our friends? And what he says, right, is we need to just take it one at a time. We've talked about this drawing inwards. Treat people from the third circle as if they were the second, the fourth as if the third, bringing them closer and closer. Eventually, right, treating everyone as if we are family, or even the Stoics say, have a certain sort of kinship with them, right? Brothers and sisters. And that's what I think is really needed to get cosmopolitanism, right? Is that we need both this, what we do as non-sages, and both what the sage would do. And that sort of recommendation is quite helpful in navigating this, right? And so I want to turn a little bit to these sort of fully developed descriptions of cosmopolitanism, right? I want to sort of talk a little bit. I think we can get these quotes, or at least get what these quotes are talking about, merely from the early sources that I mentioned, right? Plutarch tells us that the Stoics held this view. We should regard all men as fellow citizens and local residents. I think that alone we can derive from the rational and social nature of humanity. If we're rational, we can recognize others as like us. And since others are like us and they are intrinsically valuable, that motivates our social nature, right? There should be one way of life like that of a herd grazing together and nurtured by a common law. Again, Chrysippus refers to that common law, that right reason which pervades everything. If we live in accord with that, we're killing it, right? And that's going to be what that looks like. Turning to a more distinctively Stoic description of it, I want to touch on this description from Marcus. This passage of his really resonates with me from Book 9. And that's that what he advises you to do is to ground yourself, to remember what you are by referencing things other than yourself. I find that really interesting. But he grounds your own intelligence, asking what our nature is. I'm a rational and social being. Grounding myself in the world's intelligence, right? That's that universal nature that we're grounding ourselves in. Again, referencing that passage from Chrysippus. And that your neighbor's intelligence. And I think that is the really social piece, right? We step forward and we are able to recognize others as like us. And by remembering that we are the same as them and seeing sort of ideally how someone virtuous is dealing and living in accord with their nature, I think that we can remind ourselves in a way to sort of come back to ourselves, to remember what we are, and to actually push forward and reground ourselves in this cosmopolitan force, right? And so that's really the shtick of my argument, is that, yes, we have these complex cosmopolitan descriptions that we get from the later Stoics. We get our developed Marcus Aurelius passages, or Epictetus and Seneca passages describing cosmopolitanism. But it's not as if it was a new idea that entered its way throughout the history of Stoicism. I think that this idea is derivable from those early Stoic pieces. All we need to know is that virtue is living in accord with nature, and that is the chief good, and that there is a universal nature and our individual nature, which we must live in accord with, and that we are rational social beings, and that universal nature is rational. I think with those pieces alone, what we can do is really recognize this community of the universe, right? Recognize this rational community and begin to pull them closer once we sort of make that recognition. And I think it's beautiful and exceptional for Stoicism that you can get these pieces that seem to take hundreds of years to develop when you look at just the texts from these sort of basic bits of early Stoicism. Thank you.
All right. I'm Not there we go. Now I'm seeing myself. Thank you for that really well put together discussion, citing lots of Stoic texts, bringing them together. I'll remind everybody that if there's parts of this that you missed out on, or need to go back over again, we're recording all of this. We're gonna break each of these up into separate videos that you can go back over, and we can provide the slides that the speakers have been so graciously offering us as well. So I've got a question here in the chat that's kind of an intriguing one. This is from Sasha Roter. Would you say that for the Stoic sage, the circles converge to one singularity? That is, collapse into just like one little node.
I think that's an okay way of thinking about it, as long as we accept that it is everything that collapses into that one node, right? And I think, yes, except for the fact that they're still going to take into account the differences in what's up to us, right?
Okay.
The majority of those circles are still going to be outside of our control, but I think that's the only distance between them. I think it'd be like almost a singularity, 2 points maybe, that can just barely not quite converge.
So here's a follow-up to that. None of us are sages, right? The sage, if they do exist, come around every 500 years, we're told by good Stoic sources. So I'll put it to you this way. What do you think the best that those of us who are muddling along can hope for in this respect?
Well, I think that the majority of us are going to end up still prioritizing our local communities, right? Though I've kind of argued against the moral value of those communities based on their closeness to you, that I think that still has some practical force, right? Just because I'm pursuing cosmopolitanism doesn't mean I'm going to fly to Africa to solve world hunger when there's a soup kitchen I could volunteer at down the street, right? And there's plenty of members in my community suffering from lack of food. And I think that for what most of us have to do ultimately is prioritize, right? And I think that all we can really do is get better and better at that, right? It's this constant sort of approaching that really gets us there. And I think that for most of us, we get these glimpses of these far-reaching communities, right? Events like this are ways of us to sort of reach out into those further circles, and especially right in the age of the internet, and even in the sort of post-COVID era when we realized how much can be done online. I think we're able to kind of expand further out. So I think that's what I'd say, is that the best of us can hope for pushing our priorities outwards. We're still going to have our local burdens, and we can kind of reach out further on occasion and pull people in.
So there are some questions coming up in the chat, and I'll get to them in a moment, but I do want to follow up on what you said just there. So one of the big other, movements of, we could call it philosophy as a way of life, comes from, roughly speaking, the utilitarian perspective, the effective altruist idea. Now they've got, the actual institution and movement, they got themselves in a little trouble recently, but let's think about them at their best. So, Peter Singer talks about these expanding circles as well, but there's also a sense of getting, let's call it, bang for your buck, right? So you mentioned helping children in Africa, and Peter Singer's argument will typically be, well, you could do stuff in your local community, but by contributing to a charity overseas, you can probably do a lot more good. So where do you think Stoics should fit in on this? Do you think there should be an emphasis on local community that the effective altruist might find objectionable, or do you think the Stoics should follow along with their ideas?
So I think it's incredibly conditional. I think that answer is going to depend a lot on what the actual sort of status of my local community is.
Okay.
Right. And how sort of poor off my community is, so to speak. But I think an additional thing that comes up here is that Stoics really don't make any room for comparison between harms. And so it seems like what Peter Singer might bring up is something like, the conditions in Africa are objectively worse than the conditions of a homeless person in America, or something like that. And I don't know that the Stoics would be happy to accept that kind of thing. And tell me if I'm getting off topic here, but it seems like, what that ultimately is going to look like, I think, is that the utilitarian kind of in reaching outward to the circles forgets about themselves in a sense, right? And I think if they were to completely just remove themselves from the equation, that's going to get rid of some important pieces that have that practical import of where I should kind of guide my efforts.
Yeah, I'll just say this. I think that's where the effective altruist organizations got themselves in a lot of trouble. They paid too much attention to themselves as agents of helping and change and saw that as a pretext for having very nice things. So, but that's a whole other topic. Allison has a great question here. Rationality came up quite a bit, but on your account, can non-human animals be included as well?
Yeah. And so I think that yes is short answer on my account, but I think that there are also some sources from ancient Stoicism that might indicate that there was a possibility of that in the ancient Stoic account as well. I've read a particular passage from, I think it was Alexander of Aphrodisias, right? But I've talked about how every person's circle or set of concentric circles is going to look different. And I think that, we all have different capacities outside of our initial rationality. And so I think that non-human rationality could fit into the Stoic picture, but it puts the Stoics in an interesting position of having to articulate what non-human rationality looks like. I think it might expose maybe some anthropomorphization or anthropocentrism in the Stoic view. But I think there's definitely room for that.
Yeah, following up on that. So we see in traditional Stoic texts, and they're not unique in this. I mean, everybody in the ancient world thought there was a fundamental shift between other humans or other animals, sorry, the brutes, and then us who are rational. And you'll see them saying things like non-rational nature is there for rational nature. Maybe in our time, we'd want to have a more nuanced view on that sort of relation. So we're not just exploiting the non-rational animals or.
Yeah, and I think we can avoid maybe some pitfalls of we don't want to take the Descartes stance and say that animals are soulless automatons, right?
Yeah,
they clearly have something above and beyond what we get when we interact with insects, for example. When you look at a dog versus insect.
Scott points out something like that. My dog can't set up a Zoom meeting, but he's clearly got stuff going on in his brain,
Absolutely.
So there was another question. Here we go. So I think this is a sort of a challenge. Michael says, homeless people living on your street, not good for the neighborhood. If we help, that promotes them to stay there. How can we help? I want to do something for them the Stoic way. So I guess the question there is assuming that if we help them, then they're going to stay there on the street. Mm-hmm. What would your response to that be?
I think that we would have a particularly Stoic sense of helping there, right? I think if we think that problem may arise if we take helping to mean something like alleviating suffering or, getting rid of the consequences of the position that they're in. I think that would be a case of maybe treating the symptom and not the problem, right? And for Stoics, I think that help would look a lot more like this habilitation or reform that was mentioned in the sort of prison panel, right? We would be not so much alleviating that person's situation, but rather giving them the tools to alleviate their situation themselves, right? Ideally, sort of giving them the power or whatever sort of reframing they need in order to change their situation. And I think that we see initiatives of this sort of reforming type actually have those results with some communities like that.
Yeah, Jorg has a comment on that saying, in the 90s, I was helping homeless people by giving them a chance with a job in my company. They would get a flat again, and so it went on. And I think that's really a central part of it, being able to afford a place of your own that doesn't have to be particularly great, but actually is your own. And, I realize we're ranging over a lot of non-Stoic things, but, universal basic income proposals have been shown to help out with these sorts of things, or just actually giving homeless people a place to stay, even if some of them are going to to, not treat it that well. On the aggregate, it actually does help to get people off the streets and more independent. So now Harold has a question here. Is there a tension between Heracles' thought about the expanding self and Epictetus, who seems to reduce the self to just proeresis? What do you think?
I think there is a tension there.
Okay.
And so, I mean, I think I'm motivated by that tension on a sort of scholarly level. It's really I mean, and I think that's what we have to keep in mind. That's the only way for this to work is if when we expand ourselves, we keep in mind which parts of our new expanded self, so to speak, are going to be up to us. And so I think that, there is this kind of tension. And I don't know that we can ever, because of this difference in what is up to us, achieve, so to speak, a truly expanded self, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So again, leading off into a bigger picture thing, I tend to think that the Stoic texts and thinkers that we have, there are some deep tensions in them. And I don't see that as a bad thing, because if a philosophy is supposed to embrace and somehow guide us through this incredibly complex reality that we inhabit, part of which is the fact that we're so complex and often complexly screwed up, it better cover an awful lot. And so I'm actually a bit distrustful of philosophical schools where everything fits together neatly and the system is perfect. And I'd be curious to get your take on that. Do you attention is not the same thing as an outright contradiction. Where do you sit on that?
Yeah, and so I actually think there's an important thing here to keep in mind that Stoics say that the goal of philosophy is wisdom, and wisdom is living according to virtue, right? And so I think this type of revisionism, in a sense, or maybe that's a strong term, but inquiring about these tensions and trying to sort of tease them apart and figure them out, I think that serves the goal of philosophy, right? I think that actually serves to kind of strengthen Stoicism, because Stoicism is not a system that claims that it's perfect, or at least I don't understand it as being such. There are definitely those who do make that claim, but I think Stoicism, the philosophy itself, let alone the life view that it articulates, is one of progress, is one of a process. And I think that it's moving forward, and that furthers the goal of philosophy, not achieving that sort of systemic perfection.
So here's a question from Taras, who is over in the Ukraine. How, from the perspective of cosmopolitanism and Heracles, should we treat our enemies? For instance, those who are killing us or bent on killing us.
Yeah, I think it's really easy for me to say, as a person who doesn't have to deal with that type of enemy very much, that what the Stoics would articulate is understanding, in a sense. I think it's that recognition. We wouldn't want to demonize those people. We'd want to sort of look at the narrative and say, okay, right, at some sense, similar to sort of what Rob was talking about last panel with the decision to murder someone, at some level, right, there is a framework on which this decision makes sense. And we need to sort of understand what that framework is and kind of engage with it when possible. And of course, right, when we're dealing with people who are killing us, that type of engagement is going to be incredibly difficult. And I think it may not be even strictly possible in certain senses, right? But what we need to do is, I guess, we can't turn our backs on them. We need to keep an eye out for that opportunity where we're able to engage with those people, with those individuals, with these institutions. And I think with the type of, Ukraine type things that we're talking about here, what we're talking about is massive institutions that are at play. And I think that while that has some import there, we need to focus on them as aggregates of individuals, right? Understanding how a group of people actually made this decision in some way or another.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a case like that, we're dealing with a lot of people who are just caught up within a system that throws them, for example, out into the front and doesn't give them much choices. And, we'll probably never get to understand somebody who is an enemy in a situation like that. I mean, Cicero talks about this in On Duties, that he stresses that there are duties even to enemies. So that assumes that there are enemies, and then does talk about the limit case of enemies with whom you just can't reason with at all. You can't do anything with them, but views that as sort of the exception. But perhaps we live in times where there are some exceptions like that.
Yeah.
Phil had a question as we're getting to a close. Jackson said that he felt Stoic virtue ethics were superior in function to some other systems. I'd like to hear him expand on that. So perhaps that has to do with other virtue ethics, or perhaps that's just in general.
Does, yeah. I am more qualified to talk about virtue ethics than ethics in general, so I'll stick with that one. Yeah, so what I think, basically what I've picked up on in these other systems that I talked about in Aristotle and in Confucius, I think that they rely on this idea of virtue emanating throughout the universe. They think that virtue is this sort of complete notion that has this sort of passive effect of that when people see virtuous behavior, I think they're supposed to automatically recognize it and recognize its value. And as with other parts of Aristotle's philosophy, I find that to be not so empirically true. That in my experiences with people, that's sort of more rarely what we get, is that kind of engagement. And so, and that people, when you try to live according to Stoic virtue and you do things like let someone harm you, and people think you're crazy. They don't look at you and say, oh, wow, what a virtuous guy. I can totally recognize that's awesomely virtuous. And I think that's probably a bit of a straw man of what Aristotle and Confucius are arguing here. But I do think that the active component that Stoicism gives us is incredibly valuable for actually living your life according to this philosophy.
Well, let's thank our presenter, Jackson.